Welcome back to the AI Corner podcast. I'm stoked to have Dan Browne join me today. Dan runs a creative agency in Napier, working on video production, storytelling, all the creative elements of agency work that a video agency sort of goes after. Dan's been in the business for about 16 years, so he's certainly seen a shift in how work gets done in an agency and how video and creative get produced. And I hazard a guess, Dan, you've never seen a shift like this before. This must be 10x any previous transformation, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's been pretty crazy. But also at the same time, kind of slow, I think, as far as a lot of my counterparts probably go. Um,
Interesting. We'll certainly dig into that and to see what you're seeing around the Hawke's Bay and what your peers are up to in the space. But welcome to
yeah,
the pod. Looking forward to learning a bit more about some of the work you've been up to. I'm especially interested in what you've been doing around generating AI imagery for documentaries around the pre-earthquake in Napier and various stories around the Holocaust. There's some fascinating work that you're doing in that space. But why don't you give us a bit of a window into the shift you've seen in the last couple of years or more recently with how your agency has evolved and what drove that shift in particular?
yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think I'm a bit of a geek to start off with, so I've always been very tech led. And so we've been doing like lots of stuff in the VR space and the 360 space kind of before AI came into the picture. um, as well as all the normal kind of traditional video content and stills and normal media and stuff. But I mean, obviously when GPT came out, everyone was kind of using it as a chatbot and talking to it from that point of view. But then I felt like there was a lot of opportunity to use it from a strategic business point of view. And so I think for us, it's kind of been twofold. Like there's one half of it that's been down like a I guess if you like a senior leadership type space where it's like very inward looking and kind of like coaching and building skills and resilience and all that kind of stuff. And then on the other side, there's the creative part of it, which I was fairly skeptical at the first instance, when like Will Smith eating spaghetti and The Rock eating rocks came out. Um, but like, well, even in the last few weeks, it's kind of progressed another level, and or maybe in the last month since Seedream and all that kind of stuff started hitting LinkedIn. It's just kind of growing and growing. But I think the thing that, like, if I talk to a lot of my colleagues about it, a lot of them are really nervous about what it means for the film industry in general. And
Mm.
I think that, it goes through these phases, right? Of everyone's like, oh, this is going to end all creativity and all like video jobs and all that kind of stuff. But then things kind of just settle down a bit after that and find a bit more of a rhythm that is actually a practical rhythm. And then I think we find that it just becomes another tool in the toolbox, and we're using it to kind of enhance the stuff that we're currently doing that's shot traditionally, and also do bits and bobs that would otherwise have just been way out of the reach of a lot of our clients' budgets, where we can now kind of use AI to kind of enhance that and then kind of be smarter from a business operations point of view to kind of get better visibility of where we're at, where we're going, where the finances of the business are, kind of reduce the admin time involved in a lot of stuff, and also just kind of become better as individuals as well from like a leadership point of view, managing my team, working with the team and leading the team. So that's kind of been just as big for me, I think, as the creative side of what this AI revolution has kind of unpacked.
It is fascinating, and you would have seen the news from when Ben Affleck recently sold his company to Netflix, and basically they're AI-powered filmmaking technology, right? And
Yep.
I think, he's a pretty astute businessman, more so than probably the average kind of bear out
Yep.
of Hollywood. And initially he was super, super fearful. I think he was it Joe Rogan potentially, or one of the big podcasts,
Yep.
and he's done a huge 180 because he's just leaned in and figured out, look, if you can't beat him, join him, I suppose. But also, this is where all industries are going, and creative is no different. Even though, as you say, people look at Will Smith eating spaghetti, and it's changed dramatically, and we saw the shift to VO 3.1 and all the rest of it,
Yeah,
and continues on with all the new models from there. And so I think it's a tough pill to swallow when so many people have spent decades refining a craft and that has been their identity. And
yeah,
I've often likened digital creative almost to like handcraft. If you
yeah,
think about what happened when machines came along, sure, we started buying more crap from IKEA and other stores where it's produced at scale by machines. And there's always going to be a need for that. And generative AI in the creative space is fairly similar, right? You now
yeah,
have scale in terms of producing storyboards and mock-ups, and
yeah,
obviously
yeah,
production level quality is going to get better. That'll happen in different
totally.
ways. But there's always going to be that need and desire for someone in the furniture space who handcrafts their furniture and creates like bespoke pieces. And I think in the creative space for digital and visual, and I think it's going to be bigger than just bespoke for furniture. I think that premium around human-led direction and production and acting and
Yeah,
all that is still going to have a huge place in the world, and there'll be a lot of people
yeah,
who will reject digitally or generative AI creative,
stuff. Yeah,
movies
yeah.
and creative for a
And
long time to come, right?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think as well, like, I mean, now that the tools are kind of getting so amazing, you're really seeing, I think, this kind of shift with, where it's kind of kicking out the ones that were just kind of faking it, I guess, with the traditional modes of filmmaking, where, they weren't really reaching for great heights with it, and they're, maybe slightly mediocre. And now obviously the production side of it is so easy to get to a much higher quality now that that no longer becomes a differentiator. And actually, all of the stuff that has kind of tested time around creative, concepts, writing and strategy and business experience as well is the, thing that AI, although it's kind of approaching, it doesn't have that ability to sit on the other side of the table from you and kind of be like, okay, from my past like 16 years of being in business, I've seen this happen, and this
Mm,
feels kind of like this.
totally.
And so I think it's creating that separation there, um, but I don't necessarily know that it's a bad thing.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I think there's also, you'll be familiar with Jevons Paradox, right? As the price of something goes down, demand for it increases
yeah,
because
yeah,
supply is now abundant. And
yeah,
I would argue in all of the worlds of content, of media, of audio, the reason that a lot of brands, businesses, and other people with passions haven't been able to tell their stories or build a brand or be in more spaces is down to the fact of cost and expertise gaps, right? And so if now you can deliver, not to say you should be decreasing your price, but the
yeah,
ability for you to scale your output and maybe get more done at a better bang for buck for customers, and there's hopefully more people entering the industry that play at different levels of quality and segments than you do, then everyone has access to more of the stuff. So it's not a fixed pie or zero sum game type model. There's actually, I think, the pie grows across everything. Like we're seeing that in
yeah,
software, right? And I think you and I talked about it beforehand. The reason that the software industry is only going to get bigger rather than decrease, and software engineers are going to be in more demand, is because there's been this huge latent demand for software. There are so many gaps and stacks today because these big ERPs and CRMs don't do the full job. I'd
yeah,
hazard a guess, again, back to business, the reason they don't have enough ads on social media or enough creative for social and short form video and they rely on imagery is because of the problems we've been talking about. So now we can
yeah,
hopefully solve those problems. And of course, the counter argument is AI slop and all the rest of it. But
yep,
the cream will rise to the top, right? The good stuff will make
yeah.
its way to the right people with the right message.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, we are seeing like an increase in the AI slop kind of stuff coming through, but I think, I mean, it's having like that polarizing effect on LinkedIn now when you're seeing a lot of people starting to push back on AI generated stuff.
Yeah.
I think, most of the AI slop is just, people creating stuff without really thinking it
You can
through.
see it from a mile away, right? And I
Yeah,
saw the
totally.
algorithms they've changed recently. LinkedIn in particular, they look at your content, they look at your profile, they look at how you write, and they make a good judgment. Is this actually your voice based on your experience and your point of view? And if it doesn't ladder up, it downweights your content. So
Yeah,
even LinkedIn's applying a kind of meritocracy to this, even if some of the content's written by AI, they're
yeah,
creating some matching algorithm. But we could talk about the
totally.
stuff all day. I suppose today I'd love to dig into, I mean, we've covered, your view on creative and where it's going. We'd love to dig into some of the projects that you're running
Yep.
and you mentioned, biz ops and how you run the back end. I'm sure a lot of
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
are always interested in workflows and how
Yep.
that is coming together for you. And then also
Totally.
and obviously a few of the tools, people want to know what tools everyone's using. And
Yeah. Yeah.
then probably in the last part, like how do you advise others in this space, whether they're agency owners or people just getting into their career, or those who are 30 years into their career and thinking about what do I do? How
Yep.
do you talk them off the ledge sometimes? Yeah, why don't we dig into some of the projects that you're working on because they're
Cool.
fascinating.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, and I guess just kind of going back to the progression of AI and how we've kind of utilized it through the business to kind of
Mm.
now. So obviously GPT came out, and then Midjourney was kind of the go-to for images. And so then that kind of enabled a whole bunch of opportunities for us around kind of creating director's treatments and, all of the stuff that's fairly common now. I think a lot of agencies are using AI image gen for, treatments and pitch decks and all that kind of stuff. But I guess Midjourney was our kind of go-to there for quite a while. And then moving now through to kind of where Nano Banana is and Gemini 3 for image gen, where that kind of becomes like our base, but then we're also utilizing the likes of Seedream and other models where we need to. And so there's a few different projects that we're currently in production on that have been quite AI heavy. The kind of one that I mentioned was the piece that we've just finished, but it's not public yet, was for the Taifenua here. And so in that one, we were tasked with a lot of the traditional stories of the whenua here in Napier, pre-earthquake, and kind of going back to, I guess, the 1500s. And obviously, we've not got any content from that far ago, and the budgets don't quite stretch to shooting full-blown reenactments. So AI became a really obvious tool to be able to use there in an educational sphere to try and bring a lot of this content to life and make it kind of easily consumable for kids in schools. And so with that, we also had a whole bunch of old imagery that was taken kind of early 1900s, late 1800s, which shows Napier before the earthquake and when, most of like the airport out here and all of that kind of stuff was all completely flooded. For those that don't know, when the earthquake in 1931 happened in Napier, a whole bunch of land was reclaimed from the ocean. And so the whole area looked very different. And so we've been using a whole bunch of AI tools to intercut with the traditional content that we're shooting, which is, interviews on these past sites with our local historian. And then, we've got all sorts of drone shots and things of the different areas that we're talking about, but then utilizing I think that one was mostly Nano Banana for the image gen, using that to edit frames of the videos so that we can then bring in, what a kumara pit used to look like, or how there could have been a car site that kind of, moved around here with a marae in the middle and a whole bunch of whare positioned around it. And then just using that tech in that kind of space to bring that to life.
That's awesome. I got so many questions because there were a lot of controversies at a point in time around do these image gen tools, can they accurately reflect certain cultures and scenarios at historical points in time because of biases within the model and cultural nuances that they can't reasonably be expected to have in them because Nano Banana wasn't trained by Kiwis
Yep.
who understand the
Yep.
Māori culture, for example, and
Yep.
there are a lot of folks in New Zealand where this is a hot topic for them. So I'd be curious on a couple of things. One, accuracy, and you seem pretty
Yep.
excited by it, so I'm going to make a wild assumption that it's come out pretty good.
Yeah. Yep.
Secondly, techniques to ensure accuracy around that, and then thirdly, you're working with local culture and iwi, like how receptive are they to this? It sounds like they're pretty on board. So talk us through that relationship as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so I mean, I guess as well, like a lot of it well, this whole project came from the Tai Whenua, and so they're the ones that are driving it. And so with a lot of these groups, like there's a real big focus on how do they keep their IP and how do they make sure that they're not kind of just giving away these kind of oral stories without kind of getting some gain from it as well.
Mm.
Um, but I think because it was led from them as a project that they really wanted to do, and the historian Tipene, he is of the whenua and the local hapu, and so all of his stories, are authentically for the area. He's got a lot of backing from the kaumātua around here, and so from that point of view, the cultural stuff is handled pretty well because we made sure that there was a lot of consultation as part of the process. Kaumātua were spoken to about the whole thing, the whole way. And then the other kind of really conscious part of it as well is that we decided not to show any faces, not to show any people. And the real kind of decision there was basically, I mean, like you say, we don't know what the data's been trained on, and we don't know whose tipuna might end up appearing in some of these images that we generate. Um, but we can kind of have a creative representation of, what the pā might have looked like back in the 1500s, because, ultimately no one actually knows. And so it's kind of the same in many ways as an artist coming along and doing an artist's impression, a drawing of what they think it might have looked like. They're still kind of drawing from their mind and from image sources and references and all that kind of stuff themselves. And so in that kind of sense, I think that kind of helped us ensure that we were kind of not being culturally inappropriate. And then with that, there were a whole bunch of different tools we used, but the main one that I was using for that whole process was Weavy. Have you
Mm-hmm.
used it?
Yeah.
Um, and so for those that don't know, Weavy is really handy because it's basically a node-based AI image and video generation tool that you pay for X number of credits, and then you get access to all of the different models to do all the different things. Um, and so I've got like this here. I'll try and share my screen.
Yes, wait.
Hopefully it doesn't crash because it's like a massive who's what's here. So as an example, like we had these photos. So like this is one of the photos that we had. And so this is part of a pā on little hill, I guess, called Okuri. And all of this water around here, that's all now land. So basically the airport is just kind of up to the left over here.
Wow.
And but this ships or boats used to sail through here, and so the water rised up pretty significantly. And so the workflow basically, so from there we start with that original image, but then we need to obviously move it into a 16:9 ratio because that's what our end product is. So we'll use the Nano Banana or a node from Nano Banana to help stretch that out, which it's easy as pie for Nano Banana. Can do that kind of stuff real easy. And then from
So,
there,
and when you say stretch it out, do you mean literally enrich the image, like the pixels? Is that what you're talking
oh yeah, I mean like take it from a portrait photo into a landscape photo,
Yeah.
basically.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, so like taking it from this kind of a image that's portrait over here, and then expand it into a 16:9 image there, and then from there taking it from that into something that's color. So then we've got a color version of the same image.
Mm-hmm.
And then using Kling with in start frames and end frames, then we can basically from there create an animation where it'll transition then from these old photos into like what a modern day could have that scene would have been. And
Awesome.
so then as we do that, through the documentary, we've got Tiffany there to kind of talking about what it was like around here, and we have these old photos that then start to kind of like do this like almost time-lapsey look over them as the color kind of comes back into them and the waves start kind of crashing and all that kind of stuff.
That's awesome.
Um, So that was really cool from like taking an original asset like a photo and then kind of bringing it to life.
Can I ask a couple of questions on that one?
Yeah, yeah, go on.
Because everyone always wants to know, how the sausage is made, type of thing.
Yeah,
And I would say that what we've all learnt over the past year or so, like, 12, 18, 24 months ago, it was all about prompting. And then the
yep,
models have gotten to a point where prompting has become a bit of a commodity. You still need to know
yep,
what you're doing, but the
yep,
link prompts that we used to worry about for tasks that weren't consistent or we weren't doing them the
yep.
same all the time. Is it something you would do once or twice for this particular image, I would imagine? What's your sort of, your negative prompts? Are you operating a few in there? Have you got a complex prompt? Like we've been
Um,
using Weavy a fair
for
bit.
yeah, so for these ones, it really is a really simple task for the AI to do, and so literally in this instance, the prompts are actually really short and simple, and it's creating a really good output from it. But the one of the other projects that I'll talk about, which has got a lot more complexity, we're using LLMs basically to help write the prompt to expand on it and kind of give us more of what we need. And then when we're not getting the result that we're after, then we kind of hop back into the LLM, say, hey, we're not getting what we want. Can you help us work out a new prompt? So we're prompting them to help us create prompts. Yeah. And I did when we talk about the Holocaust one, I've created a few other workflows as well, where basically we'll generate an image and I'll typically do that in free pick, and I'll either be using Nano Banana or Seedream. And then from there, once I'm happy with the image, then I will either pull it in here or send it directly to Kling. And then I've got a little workflow where I've got a base prompt that then prompts an LLM, which in this instance was Gemini, to look at the image, write me a Kling prompt that will give me a certain result, and then that prompt then that the LLM generates then goes into a Kling node with the start frame linked to the image. So then basically all I need to do then is just change out the first image, run the series of everything. It generates the prompt by itself, then that prompt goes into the prompt box of the Kling thing, and then Kling generates the video. So it
So
kind of becomes like a one-click workflow, which I guess is the goal that you want to eventually get to.
wicked,
Um,
love it. There's so much flexibility with we've used it a bit at work for various brands, and awesome to see how others are using it. Just on your your use of Kling, there's multiple video models out there. You've got
yep,
Sora One and Luma and Runway and Haley,
yep,
Halio. How do you say it?
yep, yep,
How do you think about the difference in the variety of models? Like VO3 is very good for cinematic, and photorealism is better for like Luma Ray, for example. But how do
yep.
you just have your like go-to models, or how do you
Yeah.
differentiate?
So over the years it's shifted. It started, or I was using Runway back in the day, but that was still probably in the Will Smith eating spaghetti kind of days. Um, and like my thinking at that point, because obviously, I don't know if you saw all of those AI music videos that were kind of coming out at that point, where they were kind of doing video to video type stuff, and it
Mhm.
had like a really unique look and style, where I was like, oh, okay, well, AI video is going to just become like another style, like anime or whatever, and it's because you know how it was like flicking between the different sets, but certain aspects of it would like be the same. It was kind of like it was kind of a cool look, and I think probably eventually people might be like, oh, okay, I want to try and get that like 2003 AI video look for my music video, and it'll become a thing. But then that was what I was using back then was Runway, and then that kind of evolved, and I was kind of using VO3, but it's pretty expensive, and so I was kind of really looking for other options that were at a cheaper price point, where I could kind of run a lot of gens through it, and so Kling has been my go-to, I guess, for the last like 4 or so months. And especially now, like with Kling 3 Omni, being able to use element items in it as well as character elements in it. So you get a whole bunch of really amazing consistency when, like what you used to have is you'd have someone in the scene and they're your character, and then someone walks past them and then their face changes because it doesn't have consistency from one thing to another. But here we can generate, we've got our character, you create basically like a plate of 6 photos of that character from, every angle, and then you pull that in as your character Laura sort of, but more basic than a Laura. And then you get that consistency through those shots, so then you're able to use them in multiple things.
Awesome.
Um,
Very cool.
and so that's been, but and it's also like a fairly cost-effective model compared to
Yeah.
Sora or VO.
So why don't you take us behind the scenes? You've shown us how, and it's very clear that you operate, still with the camera, you've still got drones, you've still got physical assets and property that you're using to create. You're also using AI to supplement where it might be footage, where it might
Yep,
be editing, where it might be creative direction in some ways. Well, why don't you take us behind the scenes of, like, if you were to think about a workflow, so
yep.
you go from prospect or customer gets in touch, got a project for you, Dan. Like, what are your high level buckets of where AI plays a role throughout those workflows?
Yeah, for sure. So when a customer kind of first reaches out, then the first touch point for AI is typically with Fireflies, which I used to use Otter, but switched over to Fireflies about a month ago. And so that will obviously be for meeting recordings, and I'll use that for in-person meetings or for Zoom and all that kind of stuff. And then the big kind of win there is then taking the transcript and using Claude to then write a reverse brief on everything that was discussed, because typically pre-AI that would be like an hour, 2 hour long slugging away to try and get a reverse brief together for a quote, which always sucked ass. It's like the worst part of making films was quoting them. And so that'll be the initial stage. We put together a proposal, and then we kind of get through to the scripting stage or the creative phase, which typically again will start off as very human centered and kind of strategic. And those are, I guess, the kind of the core things that don't really change. And then really AI only comes into the picture from a creative point of view as a strategic decision, not a gimmick or like, oh, let's use AI for this one. It'll be a choice of a tool of, I mean, like for example, at the moment we're doing a piece where we've got a shot and the drone. We wanted to try and get the drone coming down and then kind of flying in towards the building, flying through the logo of the building, and then ending up in the warehouse, which traditionally would have been a heavy VFX budget, and so probably wouldn't have been possible at the budgets that we're normally dealing with. But then it becomes a conversation of like, okay, how do we do that? Well, the easiest way to do that now is to do it with AI, where we'll shoot the drone part as actuals, and then we take the end frame of the end of the outdoor move with the drone, and then the first frame of the indoor move of the drone, blend the two, and then we've got a nice constant shot. So it's being used in a tool to kind of help promote the creative part of it,
What
and rather than supplementing it.
what do you see for you as an agency owner? What's the value add moving forward? Obviously, you can take on more work. You've got
Yep,
arguably your team should have more capacity now, or more time to think about obviously more strategic, higher value creative work than the admin. That's a massive
yep,
positive. But in
yep,
terms of why a customer might come to you, of course, you're building some really good use cases and case studies around you're now able to recreate the past where imagery and visuals weren't available, or you're able to shoot shots as you just articulated with the drone scene. Like, why would folks come to you guys? I suppose just out of interest, and what's the selling point that you pitch to clients around AI usage within your business from your process and your creative operating
yeah.
process?
Well, I mean, AI doesn't really come into most of the discussion, and mainly there's an expectation that as soon as you slap AI into any of the language of anything, that suddenly it should cost 20 times less. And so AI only kind of really comes through after we've done that creative phase, and it becomes, like I say, just a strategic decision rather than a standalone sales pitch. So, I think the real pitch for us is around The fact that there is so much AI slop out there, there's so much content, it's such a busy space that actually you need to do things a little differently, strategically, creatively, to be able to get traction and get anywhere within that space. And AI is then a tool that can enable that in a way that we couldn't do before. But equally, I mean, like you say, with these educational projects at the moment, with this historical stuff, those clients, it would have just been an interview and B-roll of a location, but now it's interview, B-roll of a location, and we can see a par kind of pop up out of nowhere. I mean, like this other one here, if I just show, this is for the same client. And so same kind of workflow in that we start off, so here I have this shop, and these were kumara pits, or are kumara pits. And so this is the first frame of drone shot. This is the end frame of the same drone shot. And so we cut that together, and we were basically, the idea was, okay, there's the hole in the ground, so you kind of get to see it, but it's hard to really identify what it was, and especially for kids, it's hard to get a feel for what it could have been like. And then using Nano Banana, so then we'll put that into the image to get a real feel for what that could look like. And that's mostly through prompting, and I think there was some image reference, but it was basically edit this frame to add in this. And then again, using start to end motion with Kling, or start frame, end frame with Kling, create something where you see the kumara pits coming out of the ground.
Super cool. That's cool. I mean,
Super cool.
there'll be a few people watching this who it'll blow their minds what's possible, because a lot of people are used to seeing, LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, just AI kind of short form videos, which are, I don't know, people fighting on top of buildings and stuff. But when you see like genuine creative, which is, useful,
Yeah.
it really just does open your eyes as to what's possible.
Another really exciting example, which I think, when I had Tiffany, the historian, with me when I was doing this, he was like really buzzed out about it, because it's just not something that you could have done at all pre-AI, and the page just crashed again. So just before I share it, I'll let it reload. And basically, we had this piece where he's kind of talking down near this karaka tree, and they're in the process of trying to regenerate the karaka tree, but basically the seeds used to be eaten, but if you don't prepare them properly, they're poisonous. And so you've got to prepare them in a really specific way. But basically, you need to wash them in a river, and they used to have them in like a little kete, but it was all sealed up, so it was kind of like a kete, but it was more like a net type thing. And so you'd have the karaka seeds, take out the flesh, put them in this net, and then put them in some water that had to be moving water to kind of wash out all the poison. And then you taste it to see if it was all good, and then you could eat it. So basically, we had the image of the net. We managed to find something that was kind of works, and then we had found a bunch of images of karaka seeds, of what they look like, of the nut, and then using Nano Banana, we were then able to put the seeds or the nuts inside the kete, basically. And then from there, we were able to take that kete that we generated with Nano Banana with the nuts inside, and then put that into a river. And then he was like, oh, there should be a rope tied onto it. So we're like, okay, sweet, we'll do that. And so we prompted that with another Nano Banana node to then create that. And then through there into Kling, so then we can have this image that, was really something that as a historian, you can kind of like dreaming up, and I'm like imagining, oh, this is how this would have happened by kind of pulling on all these different stories from different people. But it's kind of the first time where I was like, oh, actually, this is super cool. Like, we're taking something that is in someone's mind and would be really hard to translate into reality before this stuff came along. And now we're able to kind of like step through that process, and he can sit next to me and we can kind of go through and we're editing the things. And he's like, oh, I think, it probably would have been like this. And we like add this in and so on and so forth. So an exciting process.
Even that's just such a totally different way of working, right? Because previously you would have to, one, if it wasn't possible, you wouldn't be able to shoot it. Two,
Yeah.
if it was possible, you'd have to go shoot it and then you'd have to go away and do post-production. Or if
Yeah.
you were doing something through, I don't know, CGI perhaps, or whatever the other
Yeah.
alternative might be, is that someone would have to go lock themselves away for a week and build something. Whereas,
Yeah,
just to
yeah,
work with the client in real time, get that feedback, you can bounce the ball between the parties very, very quickly, which means that,
yeah,
the time to value is just so much faster for everybody involved. Obviously you can get through the work quicker, which frees up your team's time to move on to other projects. The client gets an outcome faster, which means they can get to work on their project quicker, which means, they can now come back to you for more work eventually, in a
yep,
shorter space of time. So
yep,
there's just this whole cycle or cyclical process that just benefits everybody in my mind, especially
yeah,
when
totally.
you're not taking away from anyone's work because your business is going to do the work anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, the key thing as well, from my point of view, is that, and we'll kind of get to this later probably as well, but is that making sure that like the margins aren't necessarily eroding. So the price to the client is less, the time to execute on our side is less, but actually the margin ends up being higher than what it would have been if we had to do all of the, 20 hours, 50 hours or whatever of hard work to kind of get to that end place. So I think that's kind of the paradigm that we'll find for agencies and creative services is actually it ends up meaning that you can keep more margin down the bottom of the pipeline by using a lot of these tools and the client still, gets a discount. You're doing it faster and with all these tools and so on, but you end up with a larger piece of the pie.
I think it applies to all services businesses where you're delivering some form of kind of agency model, right? We see it in our world where we're able to produce use cases much more quickly. Obviously, the second time you do it, you're lifting and shifting a similar design pattern or prompts or the applications, you can deconstruct it and use parts of it. I'm assuming it's the same in your space. You built that one-click workflow. Next time
Yep.
you're changing the front and the end frames and maybe tweaking the prompting. But
Yeah.
ultimately, you're just getting quicker and quicker over time, and that ability will just get faster and faster as we move towards, the open claws of the world becoming more production level ready and being able to be used by everybody rather than just the niche or the narrow.
Yeah.
And that means that you'll come off a call and basically it'll just go and mock something up for you to an extent where you're thinking, "Shit, what what role am I playing in this?" Which is, still have the expertise of the
Yep.
relationship and the judgment, but that time to the execution time just collapses, which is awesome.
Totally. Yeah. That's very exciting.
So, Dan, why don't you tell us about the Holocaust project that you're working on?
Yep, for sure. So we were approached basically to make a documentary series where we were interviewing some of the last remaining survivors of the Holocaust who are still in New Zealand. And there's only 5 of them, I think, left in New Zealand now. And so one of them was this beautiful old lady. She's 102, and she was born in the 20s, I think, that makes her. And so she was 17 when the Nazis invaded Holland. Firstly, it's just super rare that you have anyone who was, an adult basically during that time still, and who can kind of remember a lot of the stories of what happened, because a lot of the people who are still around, they were very young at that time. But so, she had all these beautiful stories about her life before the war and then going through the war, how she was in hiding through the whole thing, and all the friends that she lost who died, and so on. And we had this other guy, he was 6 when he was sent off to a concentration camp, and um, and then he was in the concentration camp for 4 or so years, I think. His father died, so did his grandparents, and then Himmler made a deal with the Swiss to release a bunch of Jews from the camp, and he was one of them. And obviously, for both of these stories, as well as all the historical stuff that we have, none of them really had much data, imagery, whatever, from when their time there. So we've been using AI to regenerate the stories as they're talking about them. And so that's been super powerful. Firstly, we're using it from a research point of view to try and dig deeper, using Perplexity quite a bit for that, to try and learn more about what it would have been like at the time. Like with the elderly lady, we found out what her address was she was at when the Nazis came and stormed her house and took her family. And so in the AI imagery, we were able to use like a street view image of the house as a reference point for the Nano Banana prompt to then, you know, take us back in time, see a truck coming in with Nazis jumping out of it and going and kind of smashing on her door and stuff. But the house that you see in the background is actually her house that we've kind of grabbed from Street View. And so we're kind of pulling in all these different elements as we find them and, you know, and using real elements to try and make it as authentic as possible. But again, it's a project where the budget wouldn't have allowed to actually shoot all of these scenes all around the world and recreations, and that means that we're able to do it in a really engaging way that's going to be engaging for school kids and stuff like that.
Super impressive.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting project, and it's been crazy as well just how much the AI has moved forwards since we started the project. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that we had to have all these hacks to try and work through at the beginning of the project that we're now able to kind of do much smoother. Like for example, Kling 3.0 coming out, and also Nano Banana coming out. But that's also created some problems because the big models you can't. I mean, as soon as you do anything with Nazis in them,
Mm.
they shut down and tell you, no, sorry, I can't do that. And anything that's got children in them who might look like they're being harmed or in bad conditions, it kind of shuts down and says, no, we can't do that. Thankfully, we've been saved in the last month by Seedream coming out and having like a similar quality level as Nano Banana. But the servers have not been as tanked up as Nano Banana and as Google's ones have, so we can generate stuff a lot quicker, and they don't have quite as many restrictions on the imagery that we create from it. So that's made certain things a lot easier. But what we would have to do is you'd basically have to trick it, and so you can only kind of really get around it by having a conversation history in there where you explain what the project is and what you're trying to do, or you go through and you start like we had this shot in Auschwitz with Dr. Mengele, who, if people don't know, he was the one kind of that did all the medical experiments. And so for that, we found an image of him and we, were, okay, put this person, recolorize this photo, put this person into, a scene with a stone path and brick walls. And you kind of build up the elements gradually, but you don't actually tell it what it's doing. And because they've also got other protections in Nano Banana and Google where you can't search, hey, say this, who is this person in this image unless it's a celebrity. So it doesn't know necessarily who it is until right at the end, and then it starts blocking you once it's kind of worked it out. But at least you managed to get to that point with those tools, and then you can do any other little tweaks with Photoshop or whatever.
Super fascinating. I've never heard of that approach to building up from the ground up to get around those restrictions. But super interesting, mate. You're at the cutting edge of doing it in the creative space in New Zealand. You see people doing it in pockets, but to deploy it at scale across really high value documentaries and so forth is really fascinating. So, if you were to advise others in the creative space, whether they're long time, institutions or folks who are potentially feeling under threat, or those even just getting into their career, like what do you coach people on to future-proof themselves, and what's the mindset you encourage?
I mean, really, it's just around experimentation and just playing with a lot of these models. I think, there's like a lot of pushback from creatives around the fact that it was kind of trained on data that they didn't have copyright for and all that kind of stuff. But I think the reality of the situation is the cat's kind of out of the bag and they're there now and there's no putting that back. And so really and I think also as a creative, it can be quite freeing to play around with these models and be like, oh, actually, wow, there's all these stories that I've been wanting to tell. Now I've got the opportunity to tell them with these tools that we've got access to. But I think the key is just making sure that you still don't lose those traditional skills and make sure that everything that you're doing is kind of grounded in those kind of traditional filmmaking skills. And then that's how you get the stuff that's not AI slop. but experimenting with different models. There's so many models out there, and they all have different flavors and results and things like that. But yeah.
Okay. Well, hey, Dan, really, really thankful for you to come on the podcast and to show us some of the work that you're doing. Really impressive to hear about your creative approach from leveraging the real world video production and leveraging AI to complement each other rather than it just being a one-for-one substitute. I think that'll be really interesting for a lot of people in the space who are unsure of how it really applies beyond, as you say, the back-end workflow stuff of how do I take, transcripts and so forth and produce briefs. I'm sure a lot of people are working in that fashion, but the actual image and visual creation is super neat to see in reality. And then thank you to all of the listeners who have dialed in and listened to us on Spotify or watched on YouTube as well. Please subscribe and follow the podcast. We've got many more leaders in New Zealand and Australia who will be sharing their stories on how they've changed their own businesses and the use cases they're developing to be more effective with AI. Look forward to having you on the next one.